So, hello, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to History, This Week in History with Mike and Will, where Will tells Mike stuff and Mike nods and learns.
Hopefully.
So, last week we discussed the Battle of Sekigahara.
Very good.
And then this week now we're going to be discussing the Peace of Westphalia, which we'll get all into that in a little bit.
Yep.
Before we do that, though, next week we'll be doing this again at 3 o'clock on November the 4th, and we'll be discussing, I'm going to leave what we're discussing to the end of the show. Tell you a little surprise. So I hope you're enjoying this. If you have any questions or have any corrections, please put those in the comments section down below. I don't think we have it from last week, do we?
No, I didn't see any.
No, we don't. I think we
Hooray, I know the most about Japan in this small circle of people who watch.
Either people were too afraid to answer or they just didn't know.
They didn't know.
So
I could have been lying the whole time.
He is Bill. Well, Will. Sorry, my dad's name is Bill, and he watches this sometimes, and so that's why I confused the two. Anyway, we've started the hour. Will has 1 hour to explain to me the Peace of Westphalia, and the sands is ticking away, like the hours of time.
Yes, sands through the hourglass. So are the days of our lives. Before we begin, I'd like to thank where's the thing? Crystal Coffee out on Packerland Drive for providing the libations today. And by providing, I mean I gave them money.
Not a sponsor.
Not a sponsor, but
damn fine coffee.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So
today we're discussing
the Peace of Westphalia.
Yes,
took place on the 24th of October in 1648. All the way from we were in Japan. Now we're going all the way back to Europe.
Yep.
We're in Germany. Of another future Axis power.
1648, which is shortly after Shakespeare's time.
Yes, I think
right?
Actually.
Shakespeare, like 1500s, early 1600s?
Early 1600s.
Yes, okay. So
I think we were going through our potential things we could go over next week, and one of them was Othello was shown for the first time in like 1610.
Okay, all right. So either way, just so you have a general idea of where we are time-wise.
Getting kind of a feel for the clothes, the styles, the combat.
Although, I assume most of Europe was similar.
A lot of Europe was pretty similar about a lot of things. It was just... Well, that's the whole point of this Peace of Westphalia. So that's what we're going to talk about.
So we're in Germany.
So to have peace, we have to have had not peace, right? Got to have war.
Technically, yes.
I mean, if we just never had a war, we'd always have peace. We'd never have to acknowledge peace.
We wouldn't have a word for peace.
We wouldn't even have a word for it. We just have day.
Just isn't this nice?
This is just... But you wouldn't even call it nice, because you wouldn't know what bad was.
Good thing we have war.
Makes us thankful for the things we have. All right.
It's the best argument for war I've ever heard.
It makes us appreciate not having it.
All right.
This is, by the way, first time we've not been at war in more than 20 years now in America.
Here we go.
That's pretty cool. I don't care how you get there. As a guy who was in one, I appreciate not being in one right now.
Were you in You were in Iraq.
I was in Iraq, though.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's different. It's close.
We'll talk about someday. We'll talk about both of our military services and how his was much more military service than mine was service to the military.
It'll be a good conversation.
But that'll be for another day. Right now, we're in.
So, the Peace of Westphalia is this very important event because it ended two very long wars. There was the 30 Years' War, very creatively named, and that is going to take some unpacking to explain who that was between.
Okay.
And then there's the 80 Years' War, which is much easier to explain who it was between, and that was the Dutch decided they didn't want to be owned by Spain anymore.
Oh.
So for 80 years, they fought the Spanish Empire. And this is when Spain is at its height, This when it started. So this was all of the famous conquistadors were just pillaging America.
In the 80 Years' War.
Yes.
Okay.
But the Spanish are involved in the 30 Years' War too.
Now,
all connected.
Standard question, because I've had this question every time, also about the 100 Years' War.
Mm-hmm.
What did they call it during it? They didn't call it the 80s War.
They didn't call it that. They just largely said, like, kind of, this war we're in.
Oh, okay.
It was kind of like...
this war against
the war against Spain. The war... The Dutch called their war, like, this is our revolution. Because that was their revolution.
Okay.
So when everybody says, America's the first country to have the first revolution and then have a republic, that's a lie.
Yeah, I kind of thought that was wrong.
The Dutch did it first.
I didn't
and we
think
actually
it was a lie,
based a huge amount of how we run our country off of how the Dutch do it.
Oh,
they have two chambers of Congress. They don't have a king. They never had a king. There's kings suck. They
Right.
steal all our money. We don't like it.
I can't picture a Dutch king.
No, there wasn't one.
Dutch king sounds like a cigar brand.
A Dutch cigar or a pastry.
Yeah.
Like a Dutch
Ooh,
king.
nice Dutch
I
king.
think a crown, like a crown pastry. Is it a Dutch crown? I don't know. That sounds like something. I should know that. I'm Dutch and my family are all bakers.
I'll make a note to not look that up later.
I'll ask my aunts.
Dutch
They all worked at the
king
bakery. They can tell me.
Pastry.
Dutch king pastry. Mm-hmm.
All right.
It's a non-existent thing.
So
It's
the
like a Dutch
80
king.
Years' War, Spain versus Dutchland.
Yep. And then the 30 Years' War had two phases. Originally, so I have it written down so I don't get the dates wrong. So 1618 is when it started. 1635, between those years, it was a civil war. It was just Germany was working some stuff out.
Okay. For how many years?
For 17 years.
17 years.
And then the rest of that war, the rest of the European powers were very heavily involved. And it turned into a France fighting their war with Spain because they had huge issues with each other. And then France kind of using Sweden as a buddy, and Spain using the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany, as its buddy. And
So
they
this
just kind of it turned into this giant thing.
at this time, the Roman Empire is still a thing.
So that's a good question. So the Holy Roman Empire goes back to our buddy Charlemagne.
Yes.
I think that was one of the very first things we talked about was Charlemagne.
I got 48 BC written down.
That's not Charlemagne.
No, that's what I got written down.
I think that was the number one. Charlemagne was back in the he died in like 818, I think. He died in the 800s.
I don't take good notes.
So what Charlemagne had done was he brought back the idea of the Roman Empire by forging France and Germany into a unified country, and then uniting chunks of Italy, and then getting made emperor by the Pope.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't technically a Roman Empire.
Not really. It's the Holy Roman Empire.
Oh.
And what that just meant is it's this empire with the blessing of the modern Pope in Rome.
There was a Mike Myers bit when the coffee talk.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would
Can
say,
we talk?
Can we talk? And then he would say something and say discuss.
Mm.
And the one was the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Discuss. And so that was kind of funny, but I didn't know the historical ramifications of it.
So what they did is they used kind of the legacy of the Romans to try to make it seem more legitimate, and then by calling it an empire, because it was very large, it was very expansive.
Everyone wants to be part of an empire.
Yes, and originally it was France and Germany, parts of Italy, and a bunch of other client states. Eventually, the houses of the Holy Roman Empire kind of split apart. So France became its own thing.
Okay.
And then the German states became their own thing, but they remained the Holy Roman Empire.
I see.
And that was Germany, modern-day Austria, a lot of the lowland countries like Brussels, Belgium for a chunk, and it kind of shifted hands. This is a time where borders kind of shift yearly. It depends who you're fighting.
Yeah.
It depends who owes you money. And then there's also lots of client states. So, for instance, England actually, for a long period of time, owned more than half of France.
Oh.
But technically, the King of England was a vassal for the King of France. So he worked for him. So the King of France could say, go fight these people for me, and the king technically was supposed to. But because he owned more land than everybody else, he just told him no.
Oh, yeah.
And basically treated him like a dog because he was the powerful man in Europe, and that was King Henry. He was a very interesting guy. His children were...
Henry V?
No, a much better king.
Mm-hmm.
Much better king. His children were Richard the Lionheart and King John the Bastard, as he's frequently called. Because he was
King John the one that fought Robin Hood?
Yes, he was a very bad king.
So as we know, he is a lion.
Yes, like a little scrawny
lion.
And then Richard is a big chest-thumpy lion. He shows up. He always shows up at the end, and he's like,
oh yeah.
Everything. But he was actually a pretty bad king too.
Okay.
He was very famous because he's a great fighter. So, and at that time, if you're a knight walking around hitting people, that's what you want.
Sure way to fame, hit people.
So Europe is this kind of a weird hodgepodge of who owes their allegiance to whom, and it gets really complicated because there's this house called the House of Hapsberg, and this is not just a singular home. This is a group of people.
Okay, the house of...
The house, like the Plantagenets, the Bourbons, the Windsors, House of Windsor, right now is in charge of England. not really,
Right.
nominally. But so a long, long, long time ago, before there were the Crusades. I was not
You're
gonna-
almost there.
Almost.
Good start of a song.
Really?
A lot more lyrics to work that out.
Yeah, we gotta flesh that one out. So if you guys
House of Hapsberg?
House of Hapsberg. So that started under a guy named Radbot of Klettgau. Yeah.
Say again for the folks at home.
Radbot of Klettgau.
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 Yeah.
It's very German, Klettgau.
Sure is.
And this was in a part of Germany, modern Germany. Germany was not a thing. Like, Germany was, it was a bunch of provinces. It was not called Germany. It was called a lot of different stuff.
Do we know when Germany became Germany?
After Prussia. After the whole Prussian shift. That's a part of history I don't know a lot about.
Well, we can
so
discuss that
we'll
later.
discuss that in future so I can learn the exact date when Germany...
I would like to know when it became Germany, and then for a little while it was two Germanys, and now it's back to just Germany.
Germany. Yep, that's right. So this Radbot of Klettgau, he was born in 985 and lived until 1045. During that, he's kind of the progenitor of the household.
Okay.
He named his castle Hapsberg. And then after that, his line of family members became kings. And his last descendant, who there are still Hapsburgs across the globe, because there were a lot of them. His last who ruled was Charles I, who was born in 1887 and lived until 1922. And he was actually in charge, and his daddy was Archduke Ferdinand, who was assassinated, and that started World War I.
There we go.
So this family has been around for 1,000 years or longer.
And influencing history
yes.
in major ways.
And that's the thing, too, is that for most of European events, you go, oh, the Habsburgs in there.
Yeah.
Oh, the Habsburgs, they're everywhere. So you think we have landed elites and stuff in this country.
Yeah.
Imagine that, but for 1,000 years. Because the Habsburgs are still very wealthy, and they're still a very affluent family. It's just that they lost power during the war, and that's a totally different conversation.
Sure.
But during this time, we have two different branches of the same household. One is in Spain, and one is in Germany. And the reason that happened is because Charles V, who's a very powerful Spanish monarch, inherited both. He ended up getting both of the Holy Roman Empire and all of Spain.
Oh.
And this is Spain at its height. This is the right before the Spanish Armada. So this is, they've stolen a very large majority of South America and North America. Borrowed.
For a couple
For
centuries.
a couple centuries by killing millions of people, and
We're going to take that.
that's what So there's all of that.
Oh, by the way, this whole history week in history, we are never here to judge current day people.
Nope.
We'll judge people historically.
Historically.
Right.
We can do that because we get the lens of hindsight,
Yeah.
and you can go, after they colonized, all those people are dead.
Yeah.
That's
Strange.
That's objectively not good, I would say.
Especially for the dead people.
Especially for the millions and millions of dead people. I think the estimate is like 135 million died during those formative years. So
that's not what we're talking
that's a different
about
thing.
anyway.
It's a different thing. So, but Spain has a stranglehold on the Caribbean and trade going across the Atlantic.
Sugar.
So they have sugar. They have massive amounts of silver coming in that they're just printing coins. They have tons of gold. They would have treasure fleets that were unbelievably wealthy. And so they have this huge amount of cash on hand, which actually kind of backfires because when you have gold as your main currency and you bring in more gold, that causes inflation.
Oh.
It's different than today's inflation where money's more of a concept. It's based on what we're producing, and inflation is strictly based on
amount of stuff.
But largely, back then it's all about stuff. Nowadays it's all about like loan rates. It's literally all about just like the rates of interest. That's what controls it. And then a company going, inflation. But back then it was, we have so much gold, it doesn't have the value it used to have.
Yeah.
So they brought in so much, they devalued gold.
Oops.
By like more than, I think it was something like 80%.
Oh.
Because they
much gold.
They like quadrupled the amount of gold in Europe.
Wow. Turn that ship around.
Yeah, exactly. But then they were like, but we have to keep taking it because otherwise we won't have it because we've devalued it. We need more.
You have to start paving the streets in gold.
So Spain is this powerhouse, and it's massive, and it's hard to manage all of that. So being a bit prescient. I think it was Charles V. It might have been Charles IV. I should double check that. But either way, two very, very powerful men. So Charles, there's a lot of Charleses, decides to split the empire in two and have one son run all of Eastern Europe.
Okay.
And his other son runs the Spanish Empire, which is at the time the better chunk of land because they're making the most money. So it's like, yeah, you get this. So the Holy Roman Empire is kind of this weird hodgepodge of different cultures and ideas because it's all of this, they have this concept of Germanic freedom, which at this time is kind of weird for the nobles because feudalism is very strong. The king's becoming absolute monarch, and in Germany they're like, nope, you rule because we say you get to rule. So at the time, the Holy Roman Empire is split between different factions. There's the Palatinate, there's Saxony, there's Bavaria, there's Bohemia, there's all these chunks. Some of it is modern-day Hungary. Austria is its own piece. And they all have their electors who go in and say, okay, this is the next emperor. This is how we want the country to run. They have a Supreme Court. They have a meeting of the nobles. They have extra meetings of nobles. They have this, that, and the other thing. They have all of these systems of government. It's very big, and it's very clunky.
That would be, yes.
And this is also, right...
Especially before electricity and modern communication.
Right. So if you want to have a meeting, they would have to say, well, in a year we're going to meet and talk about outstanding issues. And largely, they ignore what's going on with the peasants because they're just going to work the land and they can deal with it.
Yep.
The peasants have their own group, but they get like one representative who has to, kind of, please, sir, can I have some more? And they just kick him. This is also at a time of huge religious change.
Okay.
So in 17 is when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, said this has to change in the Catholic Church. It starts the Protestant Reformation, and all of this starts to shift. And this is huge in Germany, because that's where he's from. It's Martin Luther's German.
Yeah, okay.
So he does this. It kind of causes a divide. There's a war over all of this. And then there is this armistice in which they say, okay, well, you guys can practice your faith, you guys can practice your faith, and then we're just going to leave it be. That starts to change again because the emperor wants more control. So it starts getting divided along religious lines, and this is very often the 30 Years' War is considered a war between the Catholics and the Protestants. But it wasn't really.
Good thing they've resolved that, though. Carry on.
Yeah. Anyway, so the emperor, because he's the Holy Roman Emperor, he's Catholic, and he's a staunch Catholic. He has a lot of support, and also his family branch is the Spanish, who are super Catholics.
Super Catholics.
Super Catholics. Not like they're really great people, because these are the people who did the Spanish Inquisition, in which millions of people were killed and persecuted, and the Spanish are hardliners. They're starting to kind of... It's funny because they started to kind of ease off. We don't need to be so hardcore. Yeah. It's like, well, they killed everybody.
I guess we can lighten up now.
We can lighten up now.
We're running out of...
You guys are all so serious about this.
We're running out of targets.
They start to become a little more pragmatic. Okay. When you get to be that big of an empire, you get a little more pragmatic. But they're still... you should still be predominantly Catholic. And the Pope is sitting there like, kick all of their faces and make them all Catholic. He's very intent on re-Catholicizing all of Germany.
That always works well, by the way, forcing your religion on other people.
Yep. So they start by sending the Jesuits into areas.
Oh, yeah. Well, you start nice. You start by asking.
Yes. So the Jesuits were educators and a little forceful. And they were largely considered like spy masters and traitors and things like that. But it was because the Pope would send them out, and the different lords would establish them as their preachers, like their personal confessor, and then they'd make them a little more... They'd push them a little bit, nudge them more extreme, more focused on Catholicism, and then they'd be like, and now kill all the Protestants. And they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great.
We gave you the chance.
And it's like they worked them into You start out like, oh, yeah,
Sure.
religious tolerance is fine. Let's just talk about Catholicism, talk about the church. And then you're like, maybe those Protestants shouldn't be so pushy with you and your rights as a noble. Oh, those Protestants were a little much today. And then, they're trying to kill you, kill them first.
It's weird how holy wars start.
Yep.
It seems so righteous.
Yes, especially when it's this kind of a weird civil holy war.
Yeah.
Because they're all worshiping the same thing. It's just how they're worshiping it that starts to shift. But that's very commonly seen as the big divider.
Okay.
There was Catholic versus Protestant, Protestant versus Catholic, and they just hated each other, but that really wasn't what it was. The problems came from lines of succession over who were going to get chunks of land, which is always problematic.
Yeah.
But because Germany's got this really clunky system, and they're like cash poor. Because there's transitioning from like this feudal medieval style of doing things. They're still trying to play catch up with kind of the rest of Europe.
Okay.
So unlike today, where Germany's seen as this very efficient, very work ethic, maybe it's because of this span of history where they weren't really caught up. So it's very agrarian, but Germany's not great land for agriculture because they have kind of long, harsh winters and autumns, whereas France could do agrarian culture, and it's like, it's nice. Most of the year it is nice. We get some rain, we have lots of wine, and we just grow things.
What would Germany be equivalent to here in the U.S. that we could, weather-wise?
Weather-wise, Wisconsin. I think that's why so many Germans came here.
Here we go.
Like, this is like home.
This is what it feels like.
This feels like home. Back in Saxony. This is what we had.
Remember when you couldn't grow things?
Look, the ground is just as hard.
Oh,
this is perfect.
Let's stay here.
Yeah. That's I think probably right.
It's probably exactly
That's,
how.
I think exactly.
Although in German.
Put that down. Yeah.
Not just German accents.
Yeah. No, actually, all Germans they speak. They just speak with a German accent. That's the difference in the language.
This is the big myth about Europe: is that they all speak English, just with the funny accents that we hear.
We just can't understand it.
Yeah, that's the problem.
That's the difference. So anyway, there's this heightened tension growing in Germany where the emperor is being kind of pushed to make everything Catholic, but he's also a pragmatist. He's like, oh well, if I make it all Catholic, that's going to alienate a lot of my people, because Protestantism is very popular.
Yeah.
But most of the power is in the hands of the nobles, who are almost all Catholic. So it's kind of this is much more of a ruling class versus lower class kind of a thing. So a few guys get really frustrated one day, and this is one of my favorite historical events, and I probably should.
Oh boy!
I got to get the date right because there were 3 of these.
This is exciting.
This is exciting. Yes. So one day in the lovely city of Prague. Prague. Some local nobles, are fed up with the emperor and what they think is overreach. So they go to the city hall, which is a gorgeous building.
Yep.
And they storm in and they're screaming at these guys, and the guys are terrified because it's an angry mob.
Yeah.
And they pitch him out a window.
Oh.
This is not on the first floor. This is 50 feet in the air. This is the 3rd time in history this has happened. This is the 3rd defenestration of Prague. Defenestration means to throw somebody out a window. They have a word for this, and there are 3 separate times this happened.
Who did they throw out the window?
So they threw out basically some local imperial nobles, and I think it was the mayor, and then their secretary.
Oh.
The secretary had nothing to do with it.
Just taking notes here, guys.
He really was just kind of standing, and he was the last guy out the window.
Oh,
so he watches them pick his master up bodily, chuck him out the window, pick up the next guy, chuck him out the window, and he gets dumped. The craziest thing about this is nobody died.
Oh.
And the secretary landed on his feet.
Aye.
And was fine.
That doesn't sound like...
It doesn't seem possible, and it doesn't seem feasible, but what the idea is that at the base of this hill, because they threw him... The last time this happened, they threw him out a different window, and the people died. This side, there's a hill, so they hit the slope and kind of rolled down it. Plus it was cold, so they were wearing heavy clothing, kind of padded it. How the dude landed on his feet, I have no idea. But he was just kind of like, wham! Yeah!
I feel like after your boss is thrown out the window and the second in charge is thrown out the window, that what I would hand them next would be my resume.
Yep.
And like, here, I can work for you guys.
That's probably how it went. I could switch. I could work. No, I could die. That's, I think, kind of how it went down. Right. So when
you're throwing people out the window, make sure you pick a high enough window.
High enough window, flat ground on the bottom, hard ground on the bottom.
Pro tip. All right.
Pro tip. Make sure you know where you're throwing it. Yep. Maybe if there's some spikes, that's even better.
It just seems the most...
it depends on your goal.
Yeah, I guess.
If you're just trying to rile people up, this is the perfect way to do it. Because this caused a massive revolution. Like, what happened was then, the guys who threw the people out the window, they're the anti-imperialists, we'll call them from here on out, which doesn't mean they actually hated the emperor. They just didn't like the way things were being done. Okay. So unlike the American Revolution or the Dutch Revolution that was happening at the same time, like, down with the crown, these guys are like, hey, we just have a difference of interpretation on how the laws are being put into effect. We don't like the people you've surrounded yourself with, but we consider ourselves loyal imperial citizens. And the law is just not working right.
That is a lot to put on a protest sign.
So instead, they're just anti-imperialist.
There we go. All right.
They don't like that group. And this has been building for 20 years. Actually, this has been building for like 70 years. Since that armistice happened, that kind of said, okay, you can be Catholic and you can be Lutheran and you guys can do your own thing. Ever since that, things never really settled.
Okay. So they said you can, but...
They said you can, but really, you can't. Because, that emperor died, and a new emperor came in. Yeah. And then that emperor died, and a new emperor came in. And then there's all these other dynastic issues, because there were, 4 guys who were in line to be the emperor. And then one was for a little bit, and then he died. And then one was for a little bit, and then he got ousted, and then one became the emperor full time. So it's all this craziness going on. It's not this easy, clear cut of one day the Catholics just said meh, and the Protestants said meh, and they just hit each other in the face. It was building.
Slowly building.
So at one point, there's all this maneuvering politically, and they finally have a battle, and it's the Battle of White Mountain. And the Battle of White Mountain is one of the only battles, big battles, of the 30 Years' War. And it was not a very pretty event. It was in Bohemia, and there was no Rhapsody.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I had to go there. So the anti-imperialists on this hill, White Mountain. It's not much of a mountain. It's more of a hill.
Okay. Yeah, it depends how close you are, I guess.
But these guys don't really have a clear leader.
Oh.
They don't really have, a plan. They were just kind of like rabble-rousers, down with the empire.
Yeah.
So the emperor just says, okay, fine, well, I'm going to send my army in to fight you. And so the empire army shows up. They have a much better general. They have a better plan. For some reason, the leadership for the anti-imperialists go into town to, try to organize some things and leave the army alone.
Oh.
So the army at this point has nobody in charge. All the different groups are run by their own little leaders. And they just kind of all do their own thing, as opposed to fighting. They actually had a bigger army, and they actually had a much better position, but because of just general incompetence, the imperial guys show up. And
it's difficult starting a revolution of any sort, and if you're just against organized power, that's got to be tricky to organize yourself.
Yep, and that was the thing, is they were trying to say, well, we're against this form of organization, not against organization, just this.
Yeah.
But what they were hoping to do is they're like, but we're Protestants, so we'll be all the Protestants against the Catholics. So they were appealing to every Protestant ruler in Europe. They talked to King James in England. They talked to King Christian in Denmark. They talked to the Swedes. They talked to Count, I think it was a Count Bethlen. He might have been a prince at this time, who was from Transylvania. And he was a very famous, if not consistent, warrior.
Okay.
He liked to fight, and he was always trying to become a king. So he basically you guys want to make me a king? Cool. You guys want to make me a king? Cool. You guys want to make me a king?
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm a king of everybody.
Yeah. So he would fight for different causes.
Right.
But he could never really deliver. He didn't have a modern sense of warfare. And then we're also dealing with this shift in war. So just like when we had the Battle of Sekigahara, where the guns were coming into play,
Right.
that's becoming a huge thing in Europe now. Guns, and these are much better guns than a few years before. So this is the 1600s. This is black powder has become. It's gone from when we were last in Europe, that wasn't a thing, right? When we last talked about Europe, there were no guns. It wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
Then guns become big artillery pieces to batter walls down. Then they's like, well, if it could kill a wall, what if we made it a little smaller?
Yeah.
But they're like super heavy, right?
Yeah.
And eventually they made them small enough where the Musketeers would carry them around, and they'd have a little stick, and you could rest it on the stick, and then you'd shoot it, but you'd have to carry the stick in the gun.
Sure.
So this is the start of warfare where that's going away. They're switching from what was called pike and shot warfare. You'd have guys with big sticks stabbing, so the horses, if they charge, you kill all the horses, because that was still considered the way to win a war. Cavalry charge, right?
Yeah.
So if you have big sticks, the horse will not charge the big sticks. Meanwhile, you have guys with guns inside those big piles of guys with sticks. Guys with the guns shoot. Kill the horses, kill the knights, whatever.
Now, did both sides have access to guns?
Both sides had access because they're both part of the same empire, and now guns have become fairly common.
Sure.
Some sides had better guns, some sides had more guns, some sides had different ways of doing things. And then there were two styles of warfare. There was the Spanish method and the Dutch method, is what they call it at this time, because those two were the ones just fighting all the time. So at the same time as you've got this 30 Years' War, you've got this 80 Years' War between the Dutch and Spain. And these guys have revolutionized combat at this point. This is the Spanish were the guys who came up with what was called a tercio. That's the wall of sticks.
Tercio. That'll be on the test.
Put that in there
later.
And it was they called it a hedgehog originally. It was like how the early warfare guys called it, because it's just sticks pointing out in every direction.
Yeah, okay.
And it was a big block of people and stabbing. And you'd have like a helmet and a breastplate. So like all the images of the conquistadors, that's Spain's army.
Okay.
It's just dudes, spears, some guys with guns. Originally it was crossbows. And then they developed guns well enough so they could use that. And then the Dutch were more like less spears, more guns.
Yeah.
Because the Dutch got really good at making them. The city of Antwerp is renowned at the time for creating the most reliable and largest number at the same time of handguns.
The Dutch, did they have a good, was gunpowder ever shipped in? Was that shipped in?
Well,
where does gunpowder come from?
So gunpowder is made from saltpeter.
Okay.
And sulfur, and I feel like there's one other thing. But the Dutch live in a very marshy land.
Okay.
So they could get a lot of the mixings from
so they made it right there. I
didn't
know if it was an import thing, because I know the Dutch were big on traveling in
they also had a very robust trade network,
yeah.
which is why against Spain they could keep up. They're this little dinky thing. Spain's this massive empire. Well, Spain's entire empire is not built on trade. It's built on exploitation of resources.
Taking stuff.
The Dutch are like, England, you want to trade? Germany, you want to... Like, they traded with everybody.
Yeah.
And they were trading all the way around to India. And everywhere in between. And eventually the Dutch started doing kind of the Spanish thing of local exploitation. And they got involved in the slave trade. And they did some very nefarious things as well. So it's not like the Dutch are saints.
Right. But they started out doing it better.
But they were better at trading. So they could fund this army, and their army became a professional army. Spain had this massive army, which was also a professional army, but they started to become outdated. They're like, well, we did it this way, and it always works, so we're going to keep doing it this way.
It's tricky when times are changing.
Times are changing, and especially with guns and everything becoming... Yeah. They started having, like, mobile artillery instead of just giant guns where it takes, like, teams of oxes and 100 guys to move them. These are cannons, like modern cannons almost. And there were different approaches to how to make it. And the Dutch really kind of altered how that worked. And then the Dutch also had to worry about, there's less of us. We have very limited space because it's underwater.
Yeah.
Because half of, the lowlands are reclaimed from the sea. There's all the dikes and everything. So they were masters of also manipulating those into flooding areas and limiting who can get there. So you want a little line of guys with guns shooting rather than big blocks of dudes with sticks.
Sinking into the marsh.
Right. And then with, like, heavier armor and everything like that, It's like, well, we'll just have a bunch of light armored dudes with guns and just stay over here.
Yeah.
Guns are cheap and easy to make relatively, and instead of, like, full plate armor, You can just manufacture them instead of having to handcraft everything. And then so you go from these very heavily armored guys with big spears or swords to a leather coat and a hat. You had a wide-brimmed hat largely to keep your powder dry. If it rains, you'd have your powder on your person, and you'd need like an umbrella, basically.
So you wear a little umbrella hat.
You know, an umbrella hat. That's why the Musketeers have those big hats.
Oh.
It's to help keep the powder dry. But then they'd like pin it up when they were shooting so you could see what they were doing. You didn't want a droopy hat in your face.
Boy, if you take one thing away from today's lesson, that's why the Musketeers had those funny hats.
Had those funny hats? The feathers were just for fun.
Well,
feathers are just for fun.
If
you're gonna have a big hat, have the biggest hat.
Is that why they were called Musketeers then as well?
Because they were masters of the musket. That's a thing they never really explore in the movies about the Three Musketeers. They always make them the expert swordsman.
Yeah.
And that's very rare for a musketeer to be an expert swordsman.
Yeah.
Because you're good at shooting people. The goal is to kill them before they get to you. So a lot of modern versions of it have the musketeers also be crack shots.
Interesting.
Because they should be. But yeah, the musketeers that's why they don't wear armor.
Yeah.
Because they're carrying a gun. Well, if you don't, then you don't need a big heavy sword. You can just use a light sword.
Yeah.
And also, of the Three Musketeers fame, Cardinal Richelieu, the bad guy in all of the Three Musketeers stuff, he's a very important figure during the 80 Years' War and the 30 Years' War.
Were they the three to four Musketeers?
Yep.
Were they real people, or was that a fiction?
There was a D'Artagnan.
Okay.
There was a Captain D'Artagnan who was a very famous Gascon leader of the Musketeers. So the D'Artagnan from the book is supposedly based on him.
Okay.
Where he came from kind of a rowdy area. And the Gascons, if we remember, were the guys who fought Charlemagne and ambushed his army and wiped him out, or wiped out the rear guard, and it was a very famous
You can check out the
watch our previous things.
Charlemagne, yes.
History, and again,
turns out history's all connected.
Yeah, it's like it's linked.
Yeah.
And also, if you haven't, go on our YouTube channel, subscribe to it, like the videos, share them on the Facebook, because that's that helps us feel better, and it helps get this information out there. It's good information, we think. Anyway, so we've got these changing styles of warfare, right? And some people have adapted to it really well, some haven't. The Germans are still kind of figuring out where they want to be. They largely like how the Spanish do things because they're related. So the Battle of White Mountain goes really, really, really badly for the anti-imperialists. The Empire wins, but they never really drive home the victory.
Gotta finish it.
So they get a bunch of the leaders, but a bunch of them get away, and they just keep having little rebellions. And then they go get friends, and then they go get friends, and then they go get friends, and then they have fights, and then they have other little battles, but they don't have these big one battle finishes them all fight, ever. They never have one. So that's why it lasts for 30 years, because they keep doing this.
Now, is that a matter of, as well, because the anti-imperialists were sort of a revolutionary group, there was no center person.
Yes.
So it's hard to...
Yeah, that was definitely a big part of it.
They're not center thing.
They're all over the place.
Yeah.
You squish one, but and it wasn't like East Germany versus West Germany or something like that. You've got the different principalities are all over the place. And then you also have internal squabbles. Because eventually what it turns into is the Empire gets these two great generals. They get General Tilly and Wallenstein. And they are these big personalities. And one of them is from nothing and has turned himself into the wealthiest man in Germany at the time, at the Holy Roman Empire at the time. That's Wallenstein. He becomes a duke, and he's hated by the rest of the wealthy guys because they're like, look at this upstart.
Oh, new wealth.
New wealth.
Smell it.
And he's so rich, he gives the emperor loans. Okay. And the way that you would build an army in this time is you'd have a guy go in, and he'd have a commission from the emperor to recruit troops. And he would go into an area, and he'd say, hey, now hiring. And he could build his platoon, and his regiment, and that guy was called a colonel. And a colonel could acquire so many troops, and then if they couldn't meet that standard, they had to disband. So you'd get different. That would happen a lot. But this Wallenstein guy wound up getting tens of thousands of soldiers, and the armies of the time go from having 10,000 men for the entire national army to, by the 1620s, they have 120,000 man army in the field going all over the place. Plus, at the same time, Germany has this massive set of fortifications and little bases on the Ottoman frontier because they're still fighting the Turks. They see the Turks as the existential threat. The Turks are just sitting back there going, we really hope nobody notices we have our own stuff to deal with. And then, so there's this huge geopolitical issue going on because it's, they're dealing with Turkey and this, constant Muslim threat. Everybody wants to be a crusader and all of this. That's how they paint it. And the Turks are like, we really don't care because we've got some succession issues of our own. But they poke the bear and send in help a little bit or keep offering help to keep people off balance. And it just turns into this meat grinder where you've got like the two generals, Tilly and Wallenstein, they were like enemies, but they're on the same side. So because they wouldn't support each other, that's why they never really could handle a death blow. Because Tilly would say, well, I want to go do this, and Wallenstein would say, well, I'm going to go do this, and I'm technically in charge. So there was a time where like Tilly got wounded, and he's like, I'm too wounded to help, and he just stayed laid up for the rest of the campaign because he was hurt. And it's thought that he just didn't want to go back and have to play second fiddle. So he's like, I'm wounded, and I have to keep all my guys by me. Oh, woe is me.
Oh, sad. So sad. Sorry,
so
Tilly.
Wounded. Sorry. You go on without me for the Empire.
It's like Rodney Dangerfield in Caddyshack.
Yeah. My arm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
it's broken. But the difference being, he doesn't call in the ringer to win for him.
Right. Okay.
He
right.
just takes a break.
Just not do it.
It just doesn't
right.
show up. So, you're trying to maneuver all these armies around. And then, again, you don't have the radio, you don't have a phone, you don't have satellite, You don't have anything. So everything is done by word of mouth and running people around. So there's miscommunications. And then again, just like in older wars, you have these massive baggage trains that you have to move. Otherwise, you can't get your guys from point A to point B. They don't have food. You don't have money. And money is
gold and heavy.
It's heavy. And they start debasing their coin, which means like instead of it being like this much silver in it, it's mostly silver.
Oh, okay.
And then other things, and then it's less and less and less silver, so it becomes almost worthless.
Huh.
And it becomes other metals.
It's actually worthless, although it still had intrinsic value as a coin.
As a coin.
Right.
But because the coin actually, it just loses its value because all their money is based on actual silver.
Yeah.
So they're like, well, that's still $1. It's like, yeah, but $1's worth a tenth of what it used to be worth.
Yeah.
So it's not like inflation. It's literally like they made the money less valuable.
Oops.
Like, well, you had $1, but we scraped off enough of it, so now it's actually worth a dime. And people would literally do that. They would scrape a little bit off the money over time. And if you do that to enough coins, you can make another coin.
I've thought about doing that with a $1 bill.
You take enough pieces?
You could technically, as long as it's more than 50% of a bill, you can bring that into the bank. So if it's ripped in half, but it's a little more, you can. So if you keep doing that, you could then tape together a $1 bill.
Theoretically.
Takes a lot.
You have to make it. I feel like the bank would go.
Yeah. Once I bring maybe I'd use a $100 bill to do that. Seems more efficient.
Just more efficient.
Either way, scraping metal off another metal seems easier.
Yes, and it's still debasing currency.
Sure.
So the Empire is dealing with this, and this just turns into this horrible meat grinder where there's all of these people mad at each other, and the anti-imperialists, like I said, start reaching out to other people. They start marrying the children of wealthy and important people. So there was a count from the anti-imperialist faction who married the daughter of King James of England, thinking King Jim's going to help me out.
King Jim.
Well, King James is the guy who founded Jamestown.
Oh.
So he's got early plant in Virginia. So
is he also the Bible guy? The King James Bible?
I think so, actually. I'm not actually positive on that either.
All right.
Bible people, let us know.
Yeah.
But so he's busy doing his own thing. But he's considered kind of this lion of Protestantism because he's Anglican. He's English. They're the first non-Catholic people. I mean, they're basically Catholic, but they're just like, but we can get divorced. Also, the king's in charge, and we don't want to listen to the Pope ever. But we're Catholic.
So mostly Catholic with a
mostly Catholic. Little asterisk.
Yeah.
Time. And also, England has not ever had good relationships with Spain. They just had this massive battle with their armada and annihilated the Spanish armada. So everybody's like, well, England's pretty awesome. But at this time, England isn't the powerhouse they become a century later. They're kind of recovering.
So England's not really involved in this.
Not really. They sent a lot of people over, but mostly it was Scots.
Oh, okay.
Scottish would just like to fight. And they're like, oh, well, you're going to pay us. We're going to kill some people for you. That sounds great.
Sounds great.
It sounds great. And they did. And they were very good at it. There were a lot of very famous Scottish regiments that kicked a lot of butt and made good money. But they just they were mercenaries.
Yes.
So this great idea of Protestant unity never happens. All the Protestants don't show up at the same time. But eventually they do all show up.
They should have tried a bake sale.
that
gets the Protestants together.
Everybody together.
Yeah.
Well, so Denmark at one point gets involved, and Denmark at the time is a power. It's got a stranglehold on the trade in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Especially the Baltic Sea. So that's the area north of Germany where the Swedes are, and eventually where you can get into like Russia and all of those Eastern European provinces along the coasts. Though Russia didn't have a port there yet. St. Petersburg's later. Doesn't really matter. So they've got all this money coming in from trade, so he can do kind of what the Spanish can do. He's like, I've got money. I can fight a war for a little while. Can
we have a little bit of war, please? It's so much fun.
So King Christian, this is his name.
Wow.
The Christian king.
Bit on the nose, but all right.
The fourth gets an army together, and he's like, I'm going to go help the Protestants. Well, they're still a mess and don't really have a unified front.
Oh.
And it ends badly for him. He actually loses a big chunk of Denmark in the war. But through negotiations and getting it all done at exactly the perfect time for him, they get the best deal ever. And Germany's the emperor's like, I will let you guys get out of the war and you can have all your land back. Just go away.
These are the guys who came in the war uninvited anyway.
You were uninvited. You come into my country. You know what? I just don't want to deal with you.
Yeah.
I got other stuff to do.
Get out of here.
And the emperor at the time is Ferdinand II. He's the main guy who drives the war, but he is constantly suing for peace. He's always trying to I'm sick of killing my own people and my own people killing each other.
No one's having
mess. I am not enjoying this.
We used to have so much fun during wars.
It also makes him look bad compared to the Spanish branch of his family.
Yeah.
And then they keep trying to push him on things, which makes him think the Spanish are trying to take over. So he never openly expects the Spanish to help him, and he always pushes them away. He always says, I don't want you to help me.
No, good.
And he's very careful about letting the Spanish go through Germany to fight in the Dutch Republic. He doesn't let them do that. He's very picky because it undermines his authority. It makes him look bad. It also makes him look like a stooge to the Spanish. And he's like, I'm the emperor. I don't have to listen to any of you. I do my own thing. I'm the boss. I wear my own pants.
The emperor can move anywhere he wants on the board.
Yep, that's right. And all the spaces, but he can't actually take off any pieces.
Right.
That's the difference, because he has all these guys fighting for him, but he's a pretty smart guy, and he's fairly pragmatic. He offers peace terms. He's not a hardcore extremist, although he does expect loyalty, but German loyalty. It's not absolute. His lords are expected to be able to disagree with him. That's what this whole thing was about. But it was access to the emperor that was a problem. He came in as kind of this guy that could maybe reform, and he didn't really deliver. So that's where things kind of unravel. So you've got all this bickering and fighting, and then finally there's this power to the north that's been building very slowly over time, and it's Sweden, and nobody really sees it coming.
No one expects Sweden.
Nobody does, because Sweden has been having this issue with Poland. They have a double family thing going on, just like Spain and Austria. The two brothers, one's running Poland, one's running Sweden. The guy in the guy in Poland eventually, I think it was his son or grandson, is like, I want Sweden back. And the Swedish king at the time is a lion of a man. No, he's called the Lion in the North, and his name is Gustavus Adolphus.
Ooh, I think he also got stuck in a chocolate river.
Allegedly, when he was a child. And that formative experience
That's right.
made him a warrior of great renown. So this guy...
Just realized I don't know how to spell Sweden.
Wow, I'm not going to help you on it.
S-W-E. Done.
Sweden.
Doesn't look right.
Sweden.
Yeah.
I'm sure they spelled it differently.
I'm sure they do.
So Gustavus Adolphus Rex,
Ooh.
keeps that in, is unbelievably charismatic. He is this tall, perfect blonde hair, beard, built for war kind of a guy, but he's very well liked. He's very well respected. He treats everybody with kind of the same level of buddy.
Yeah.
Whether they're his soldiers, whether they're a noble. His closest friend is this guy who was just like a student, and his name is Oxenfurt, and he was kind of treated badly by other nobles, and he was Adolphus's most trusted guy. He was like his secretary, and he ran everything, while Gustavus would go off and fight. And I mean, they worked together. He was his chief diplomat, and they were kind of this like power couple almost. They're just this duo of
you want the strong guy, and you also want the smart
guy. And Gustavus Adolphus, to his credit, was smart enough to know this guy's better at the minutia and getting government to work really well. Yeah. So
this is, by the way, all undermined by me hearing them speaking in Swedish chef voice.
Yep. And then they invade Poland.
They're less menacing.
It's a little less scary.
No.
Yeah. And Gustavus is very famous for leading from the front. He's given credit for creating the modern army, which isn't really fair because the Dutch were already doing that, and he kind of just took what they did and made it better.
Okay.
So he's like, we need less big blocks of dudes and more narrow lines of shooty guys, which is kind of what we started to see in the American Revolution. Yeah. That kind of warfare is what he really got into. Groups of cavalry flanking in and striking lightly, but not relying just on that. Yeah. Artillery pieces supporting it, and he's a big believer in it, and he's very effective.
So less blunt force, big group.
Yep. Yeah. Less of a massive war. It becomes more about people working as groups, being effective together.
Or precision.
Is very precise. Yes. And so he's got systems of, and he's engrossed with this at a young age. Like, all the toy soldiers, but unlike all the other kids are banging them together, he's like, set up formation. Yes, yes, aha. We need flags to tell people where to go. And he's kind of an innovator. He hires good people. And he goes from having the Kingdom of Sweden to having the Swedish Empire by the time he's done. Unfortunately for him, he got wounded in a battle. He got shot in the collarbone. Ooh. And they could never get the bullet out.
That's not good.
If you have a bullet, and these bullets, by the way, at the time are 75 caliber, which is 3/4 of an inch in diameter.
That's at
least that big.
And they couldn't get it out?
They couldn't get it out. It was lodged into the bone. His lead. So they could take it out, but then he could have gotten massive infection. And they're like, and just like modern days, if a bullet is inside, sometimes it's just better to leave the bullet in there. So they're like, okay, well...
Even if it's lead, I feel like that's not good to have.
Nowadays, you don't want that. Okay. You get what we call...
So they didn't quite know or care.
They didn't really know about the lead thing back then. But that wasn't the problem, though, is then he could never wear armor again. Oh. He could never wear a breastplate because no matter how he wore it, it sat funny and it would grind the bullet into him and it was excruciating.
Couldn't wear a bra either.
Couldn't wear a bra. Not that he probably needed one.
I don't know.
Oh, I
don't know his life.
Unfortunately for him, though, in a later battle, he got shot where a breastplate would have been.
Right where my armor isn't.
Where his armor couldn't be anymore. So he went from being able to wear... He always was famous. He's got lots of portraits of him wearing very ornate breastplate. Fancy guy, big dude. And then in the end, he just wore what was called the buff coat, which is the leather coat that you see a lot of those guys wear. It's kind of baggy, but thick leather. And that could stop a musket ball at long range. It would stop slashing. But if a musket hit you dead on... Close range...
Not so much.
You're going down.
And what if you wore like an off-the-shoulder sort of
That's what
armor?
I thought. I was like, well, just right over here. It could look stylish.
Yeah.
Just leave a hole.
Yeah.
Just like a hole. Get somebody to shoot.
Just aim for that spot.
But, I mean, if you can hit it, good for you.
Sure.
Man. Like, good job. So the death of Adolphus kind of slows things down a little bit. But this is after the shift in the war because, right at the start of the shift in the war, from the Civil War in Germany to Spain wants to get much more involved. And then Sweden has established itself as this power because of Gustavus Adolphus doing all of this stuff, being so powerful and famous and building up this army. And then the Dutch are still fighting, so they're still involved. And then France is a powerhouse too, and they
Perhaps.
have this brilliant mind running it in Cardinal Richelieu.
Oh,
Cardinal Richelieu is always made as a bad guy because he's a schemer,
Yeah.
but he believed very much in the power of the state and the absolute power of the monarch. He was very big. Like, a lot of people think he was trying to usurp the throne. He could control it very easily because the king that he was the advisor to was nowhere near the personality his father had been. His father was this kind of a live and let live. He let the Catholics live alongside the Huguenots, and the Huguenots were the Protestants of France. And then a Catholic didn't like that, so he murdered him. He faced a lot of threats like that because he was passive towards Huguenots.
Okay.
He let them kind of live and let live. So Richelieu cracks down on the Huguenots to the point where he just destroys their military and says, you guys can practice your faith, no more military. Only the king gets an army.
Oh, I'm sure that'll work well.
It did because he annihilated their military.
Well, that would do it as
And
well.
it was, to force the issue, they murdered an entire town, like 3,000 people. Because, that's what you do if you're a cardinal. Good Catholic cardinal.
No, you gotta send a message somehow.
You gotta send a message. So that kind of brings us to the point of why this peace needed to happen. Because
good.
over these 30 years, you don't just have this soldiers fighting soldiers anymore. They are destroying the land around them.
Yeah, you can't fight in your own yard for long.
And we're talking about, like I said, the armies go from 10,000 to 100,000 to 150,000 people, and then they're having battles not just on one front, everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere, all over the place, and it's little skirmishes. And then the treasuries of these kingdoms are empty. Except Sweden seems to have a good handle on it, and the Dutch had a good handle on it. But they're not in the... We're not fighting on their land, right? This is in Germany. So what they would do is they'd have billeting, they'd have contributions, which is, my regiment is in your town, you will feed it.
Oh.
If you don't feed it, we will take what we need.
Yeah.
That has problems.
We're used to fighting. We'll fight anybody.
You end up having towns getting completely annihilated that were loyal to the empire that got killed by the imperialists, to the point where many more civilians died during the war than soldiers. So finally, peace has to happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more nitty-gritty to get into it. I mean, the information about it, we're talking 30 years of war, almost constant, and then the 80 years war that happens. So finally, all of the leaders, they have so many foreigners involved now. And it's amazing that it doesn't become like a full-blown European war. It is, some powers in Europe, they keep feeding troops into the meat grinder, but they never directly, the Spanish don't actually march into Germany and go, take it over Germany. Like, some soldiers. It's all proxy warfare. The Spanish want to fight the French really, really badly, but they never really fight.
So that never solves anything. It just kind of keeps the war happening.
Forever. And so finally everyone's sick of it, and they have this Peace of Westphalia. And this is a massive undertaking where they're at the cities of Osnabrück and Munster. There are 109 delegations. Wow. So all of these different factions are represented. You've got Sweden, you've got France, you've got the Holy Roman Empire, you've got Spain. The Pope sends a guy, the Dutch Republic's involved, the Swiss Confederacy's involved, the independent city of Brandenburg, and then like all of the imperial states send their own people to talk things over because they want to hash all of this stuff out. And they're sick of all the death and all the murder. And so, like, just to get an idea of how big the 30 Years' War is, I had to pull this up just because it's easier to just read it off than try to read it. On the imperial side, you've got the Hapsbergs, the Spanish Empire, Bavaria, and the Catholic League. On the anti-imperials, and this is just from 1635, you've got the Kingdom of Bohemia, Sweden, the Palatinate, Savoy, Transylvania, the Dutch Republic, Denmark and Norway, the Hellebrand League, the Hesse-Kassel, Brandenburg, and Saxony. And then after the Peace of Prague, when the war gets more international, you have France, Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and Hessen-Kassel versus the Habsburgs, the Spanish, and the Denmark. So it's just a cluster of chaos. By the end of the war, more than 8 million people are estimated to have died.
Yikes.
The majority of that is civilians.
That's not good.
So, like, just looking at, like, the minimal numbers, you got 700,000 deaths in the military from disease or warfare, and the civilian side is 3.5 million.
That's a lot of our people.
Up to modern history, up until like the 1950s, that was considered the most devastating war in all of Europe because they were still, they were still counting what happened in World War II. They still hadn't fully reckoned the number of deaths in the death camps, so they hadn't realized just how many people died. But up until in the 1950s, they thought this is the worst thing that's ever happened to us for devastation of land and devastation of people. So they finally have this peace accord. And what it does is it grants all of the different princes in Germany the ability and the right to have their own faith. Okay. The empire loses, essentially. Spoilers. Even though they won all the big battles, even though they had the bigger army and the scarier army, it's just a meat grinder. And the war of attrition breaks them down. And through having all of the international powers come in, they're like, just so you know, this war's never going to end if you keep pushing this. Stop. There isn't like it's not like our revolution where we had that big final battle at Yorktown and then kicked the British out and we're like, we're done. Yeah. It's just kind of pretty.
There's nowhere to kick anybody.
Yeah, exactly. We're in their land. It's like they're just fighting. So they finally get them to all calm down a bit and say, every religion is treated equally as long as it's a Christian religion.
So mostly equal.
The Dutch Republic becomes its own country because this ends the 80 Years' War too. Yeah. Because it's all connected.
We are done with all this.
It's just like we're done. Of course, they still fight. There's still other wars going on. But
we'll keep fighting.
The Dutch get their own. The Dutch give equal rights to Jews. This is why there's a very large Jewish population in the Netherlands. Well, because they're like, people, we were just fighting for freedom. We should give freedom to everybody. Yeah. What a novel idea.
Well, Dutch.
But yeah, you had all these guys have to come to terms with their egos, their religions, and they just kind of justify. The Pope lost his mind over this peace because he's like, how dare you let these non-Catholics have equal rights? And he used every non-curse word negative way of describing the peace. And he's just like, it's unreal, it doesn't count, it's sinful, it's fake, he basically walked and said, fake news, this doesn't count. And everyone else went, we don't care what you say, we need peace, because we've had all this devastation. Everybody's broke, everybody's poor.
What a weird concept. The Pope being like, no, keep fighting.
Right, and that was the crazy bit. And that's why everyone just said, no, you don't even care. So to kind of wrap that all up, though, is you've got why we hammer on the devastation caused by this, why this peace was just kind of, Europe does a collective for a while. Yeah. There were huge bits of reform that happened with how to run the government. Trade begins to boom again. It's the early stages of the Industrial Revolution is starting to kind of kick in, where they're like, okay, well, we've devastated all this land and we've killed all of these people.
We should probably fix the stuff we broke.
We have to fix this. Oops. We have less of a farming community. We have to figure out new ways of farming. We have to figure out new ways of talking to each other. And nowadays, the modern era has kind of given this piece as like this idea of this is when international politics really kicked in. And that's kind of just a modern idea because that wasn't the goal. Yeah. But it's kind of, it is seen as a good stepping stone of this nation's in charge of its own stuff. You don't go messing around with this nation while they're trying to do stuff in their nation.
So they actually formed nations at this point.
They started to really develop the idea of sovereignty within borders. And there's a lot of debate about it between historians, but it really is a great starting point for those conversations to have, where and then you start seeing like these big shifts in the monarchies, the way the governments are run, and then this Dutch Republic thing doing very well for itself, which gives some new ideas to a lot of other people. And it shows kind of the flaws in the systems, and a lot of growth comes out of it. It's a really, really fascinating subject, but we're out of time.
We're over time.
We've been over time, but it's such a big, I was going to bring the book on it.
Just to show.
It's a big book. And it's like, it's so much stuff we're trying to cram in.
Well, perhaps we'll jump back to this topic on a future date. Maybe next year in the same week. Right now, we are going to wrap it up today. You got any last things to say about this?
No, just that it's good. Peace is good.
Peace is good. We are pro-peace.
We're pro-peace. As ex-military dudes.
Peace good. Those who are around, thank you very much. We saw some comments. We're not reading them in real time, but we'll look at those. Thank you. Join us next week. November 4th is the Thursday, and we'll be discussing
the gunpowder plot.
Otherwise known as.
The 5th of November.
Otherwise known as. V for Vendetta.
V for Vendetta thing. The V for Vendetta thing.
Yeah.
Like, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot.
There we go.
Of no reason, but the gunpowder treason should never be forgotten.
And other musical songs.
Ooh,
I am only
stories.
familiar with the movie, and I've only seen that once, like 10 years ago. So it'll be interesting for me to find out. That's
Hashtag it's not actually about modern British fascism and a superhero dude with daggers.
it's probably not as cool.
It's not as cool. It's not as sexy.
We'll find out.
But it's got some stuff. It's important.
So thank you for joining us. Join us again next week, roughly around the same time.
Yep.
We'll be discussing the gunpowder plot of 1605.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
Bye.
See you.